Okay, so we're back talking about um, the English views of the indigenous population as well as the Africans. Um, they were viewed as aliens, um, and sub-Saharan Africa was unknown until the 1500s, as we said, because the Europeans didn't really go there because they couldn't get back. They would have to walk across the Sahara Desert, so they didn't really they didn't explore there until after um, Prince Henry the Navigator and the Caravel and all that. Race is not a term that they would have used, nor was racism. It was not a developed term as well. They had civilized people versus barbarians and Christians versus heathens. But they did not have different races that they would have typified those people. Um, these anti-African stereotypes were well known in the 1600s in England. Um, the Native Americans were also considered uncivilized, but their population was so in such decline after the initial contact. Um, they were never really a candidates for slavery. They could run away. They could live on the land, and so they were not really an ever viable option as far as slavery as well. They could fade into the woodwork. Africans, on the other hand, couldn't, and basically they needed in the colonies. If you were a person of African descent, you were a slave for the most part. Throughout history, slavery, everybody's been a slave at some point. The Slavic people were the ones, that's where the word slave comes from. And so we teach slavery in American history or United States history so much because it was such a big part of our history. However, we also neglect to say many times that only 5% of the total number of slaves, to the tune of 11 to 12 million was the total, um, that the 5% of of that total actually arrived in what are the colonies of the United States. The other 95% stayed in the Caribbean or were sent to Brazil to work the cane plantations. The thing is that the conditions were so bad in those plantations that in the South, the Caribbean, and then in South America, that the people, once you arrived on a cane plantation, your life expectancy was less than 2 years because of overwork, harsh conditions, disease, those kinds of things. So there was a huge amount of turnover. Whereas in the United States or in the colonies, that was not the case so much. Slavery in the American South was like slavery nowhere else. You had large numbers of people under the control of one person. That one person had hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of land. So the white population was very spread out with this large population of Africans, African Americans, who did not want to be there, obviously. So this huge imbalance, and in South Carolina particularly, South Carolina, the slave population grew to be 60% of the total population. So they had to be very careful when you've got that many people um, who are not don't want to be there. The chances of slave uprisings were very good, particularly in South Carolina. You have this boundary of slavery and freedom because the indentured servants are now gone by the 1750s, and so they were the bridge between freedom and slavery. Now that bridge is gone because you did have all the indentured servants basically were white, so you had that intermediate class there of people. Now there's only free whites and enslaved black people for the most part. Shipping Africans was major business in the 1600s. It was institutionalized in America into the late 17th, early 18th century. Um, the first settlers in the West Indies, however, had small farms. They had white indentured servants. Sugar planters took over the best land, and then the small farmers were gone. and the white indentured servants were more and more dissatisfied, so they looked to African slaves to fill that labor need. If you don't have to remember these numbers, this just gives you an idea. In 1645, there were 11,000 white farmers with 5,000 slaves. And then you had, by 1660, you had 20,000. That's in 15 years, you had a gain of 6,000 people, white farmers and indentured servants, but you had 20,000 slaves. And if you look at 1670, 82,000 slaves on 750 plantations, and the white population is still at 20,000. So they're seriously outnumbered. The white owners are seriously outnumbered. Sugar was the first crop to be mass marketed in Europe. The Europeans had a great sugar tooth, sweet tooth, and so you had these huge profits for the planters, for the merchants in England, who were the agents who sold the sugar, and then the imperial governments who taxed it. The laws in North America about slavery were more oppressive than anywhere else. Um, you had no blacks in the militia. There were no sexual relations between Europeans and Africans. But free blacks, and there were some in the North, they could sue, they could testify. Some acquired land and slaves, and some of them had white servants. Now that's early on. That's not in the 1700s so much. The rise of Chesapeake slavery, they had indentured servants from the outset, and they don't have really blacks until, not really mentioned in the records until the 1660s. However, there were some slaves first offloaded at Jamestown in 1619. And so but they were not, there were a few, and it was not really, it was a matter of convenience. The Dutch were coming back from the Caribbean, and they had some of these enslaved people. They wanted to trade with the English at Jamestown, and so they traded enslaved people for the goods that they needed from the British in Jamestown. So there's that. Their law was that anybody with African ancestry was treated as an African, and so that was very limiting. You had Bacon's Rebellion in Jamestown in 1676, and you had Governor Berkeley, who had been in the governor for 30 years, and he was corrupt. He had very few people who had any influence at all, and they were all elite tobacco planters, the small farmers and the indentured servants, and all. They had no say-so. So they got land grants and lucrative offices. The way to really get rich in colonial America was to have an office like a justice of the peace or a surveyor or government positions, judges. They made deals with people, and they were paid on the side. So that was the great, if you wanted to get rich, that's how you did it. The only people who could vote by 1670 were people who owned land, so that cuts out a lot of people. Berkeley wanted good relations with the Indians because he was making money off of them with the trade personally, and so he didn't want to. He refused to let the white people settle on Indian land because he didn't want to make the Indians mad because they were helping him out on a personal level. Well, by 1676, people were mad, and they had confrontations between the Indians and the small farmer type colonists. So there were some raids, and some people got killed. The Indians were killed by colonists, but they killed the wrong Indians, and so that sparks this whole confrontation. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy Englishman. He had gotten to the colony in 1673. He had spent all of his dad's money, all of his inheritance in England before, and his dad sent him to the New World, to Virginia, to sort of learn his lesson. So he wanted to reduce the taxes to end the rule by the rich, and he wanted to get rid of all the Indians out of the colony so that the white settlers could get all the land. Well, most of his supporters were former indentured servants who were supposed to have land and maybe or maybe not maybe didn't get it at the end of their terms. His supporters were blacks. They were landless men and small farmers, and so they have several hundred people who support Nathaniel Bacon. He goes and he tries to deal with Governor Berkeley, who is actually a relative of Bacon's. Well, Berkeley says, no, 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 we're not going to deal with you. And so he says, I'm taking away your seat in the House of Burgesses, which is the Virginia Assembly. He had gotten a seat in the Assembly when he arrived because of his noble ancestry. And so Berkeley takes that seat away. Well, that ticks off Bacon even more. So he goes with all his supporters, and they burn Jamestown down to the ground. And so these things change after Berkeley. Berkeley flees, and the elites try to mitigate the damage. They give the property qualifications. They change it. The planters have to start dealing with the poor people more, and so this shift from white indentured servants to African slaves is accelerated because they're trying to prevent these rebellions among the white people. They reduce the taxes, they have a more aggressive Indian policy, and they open up western land to settlement, meaning the Indians lose yet again. The rebellion is over in October of that year of 1676 when Nathaniel Bacon dies of some disease, and things just kind of fall apart from there. Now, the Barbados and West Indies group, they were sugar plantations for the most part. In the Barbados, the white owners of these plantations did not want to live there because of the malaria, the yellow fever, the heat. It was miserable. So they were absentee owners. They hired overseers to live to supervise the slaves in Barbados, while the owners lived in England in the cool weather. The Barbados Slave Code dates to 1661, and this group of displaced Barbadians settles Carolina in the 1670s. The plantation colonies in the South were heavily dependent on slave labor. The plantations were so big that the white colonists were spread out maybe miles apart. So they were kind of in a dangerous position if you had enslaved populations that were very, very unhappy. These slaves had many different job descriptions: field hands, house workers, skilled workers like glass blowers and wheel and carriage makers, etc. So we talked about settling the Carolinas, and so we had already talked about that. Maryland was a Catholic haven. This is Lord Baltimore. He wanted to recreate feudal England, which is not what everybody else wanted. He brought indentured white servants. It was a tobacco colony. He wanted religious freedom with Christians, for Christians, and he created this Act of Toleration in 1649, but it had a twist. This was supposed to be a Catholic haven, where no Catholics were not welcome anywhere else in the colonies because of the ongoing feud between the Catholic Church and the Church of England. Remember, Henry VIII in the 1500s had created the Church of England with himself as the head because he wanted a divorce that the Pope would not grant. So there was a long-standing feud between these two groups. Finally, Georgia was the last colony. It was the buffer colony in 1733. This is a picture of young James Oglethorpe. He set up the colony with Savannah. It was a planned colony. He had no slaves, no rum, and no Catholics. There were debtors, there were unemployed people, but then there were also a lot of people who were not unemployed, and they grew rice and indigo and cotton in the charter years up until 1750. Oglethorpe believed that slaves would cause the white people to become lazy, and so he didn't want that for his colony. So if you went there, you had to agree to no slaves. He didn't want rum because